In late classical Greece, admiration for beauty and intellect coexisted with the harsh machinery of social control. The philosophers wrote of reason, the dramatists sang of tragic heroes, and the city-states celebrated ideals of freedom. Yet these freedoms extended only to a select few, men of citizen status, whose rights were secured by the labor, silence, and obedience of those beneath them. Women, children, and enslaved people lived within a structure designed not for their independence, but for their containment. For women in particular, life was not their own. From birth, a daughter was seen as a temporary member of her father's household, an economic and social burden whose destiny lay in marriage. A dowry accompanied her, a transaction that underscored her role as property exchanged between men. Education for girls was minimal, focused not on philosophy or statecraft, but on household management and obedience. The girl at the center of this tragedy entered her marriage not as a partner, but as a vessel, a means to extend lineage, to strengthen alliances, and to reflect her family's compliance with tradition. The age disparity between bride and groom was not unusual. Men often married in their 30s or later, once wealth and stability were secured, while brides were chosen from among the very young. To the Greek mind, the innocence of youth was prized not for its vitality, but for its pliability. A child bride would adapt easily to her husband's authority and produce heirs untainted by scandal. Her consent was irrelevant, her silence was assumed. The family's decision to marry her to a man of 60 revealed more than opportunism. It reflected the broader expectation that duty to custom outweighed individual survival. To defy these arrangements was to risk dishonor, to fracture ties of kinship, and to invite suspicion of impiety. In a society where the favor of the gods was considered essential to civic stability, compliance was not only expected, it was demanded. Marriage in this context was never private. It was a public statement, a ritualized display of obedience to both divine order and human law. Ceremonies reinforced the transition of the girl from one household to another, stripping her of autonomy and binding her to her husband's fate. She was paraded as an ornament of purity, her body symbolizing the continuity of family and city. For her, the wedding feast was not a celebration of union but the beginning of captivity. Death did not release her from this captivity. When her elderly husband neared the end of life, the customs surrounding burial extended marriage into the grave. Greek belief held that the dead should not travel alone, and that bonds forged in ritual persisted beyond the human span. To ensure harmony with the underworld, the living bride was expected to accompany the dead husband, even if it meant her own annihilation. The girl's destiny was written not by her own choices, but by the collective will of her family and community. The cruelty of this expectation lay not in a single decision, but in the system that normalized it. Each participant, father, mother, priest, elder, fulfilled roles assigned by tradition. The weight of custom pressed down with such force that even the most unnatural act appeared sanctioned. To question the sacrifice of a child would have been to question the gods themselves. In such a climate, silence became survival, and obedience became the measure of honor. It is tempting to imagine her as an isolated victim of a single ritual, but she was instead a reflection of countless unnamed girls across the Greek world. In Sparta, daughters were trained in discipline not for themselves but to bear stronger sons. In Athens, young women were secluded, kept from the agora, excluded from debate, their presence confined to household walls. Everywhere, the female body was a site of control, controlled by fathers, by husbands, by priests, and ultimately by death itself. The philosophers of Athens wrote extensively about justice, yet justice in practice was bound by gender and status. The freedom of the citizen was built upon the silence of those who could not speak. For the child bride, the grandeur of Greece's intellectual achievements meant nothing. They could not spare her from the tomb. Her life and her death illustrate the dissonance at the heart of Greek society, a civilization that celebrated reason yet perpetuated cruelty, that honored the gods with temples of marble while burying its daughters in the earth. She was not forgotten because her name was remembered, but because her suffering was absorbed into ritual, indistinguishable from countless others. In the end, her tragedy reveals the cost of control, a society willing to sacrifice its children in the name of order, tradition, and divine favor. Beneath the marble columns, beneath the shining legacy of Athens, lay silence, the silence of women and children whose lives were never their own. The girl's fate was not a crime in the eyes of her society, it was a duty. And in that truth lies the deepest horror, a culture that celebrated freedom while entombing its most vulnerable in silence and stone. In the later years of classical Greece, marriage was not always the joyous union romanticized in poetry. For many, especially women, it was a transaction, a negotiation of property, lineage, and honor. Girls could be married before their voices had settled into adulthood, often paired with men several decades their senior. One such girl, scarcely 11 years of age, was bound by her family to a man nearing 60. Her marriage, framed as duty, concealed a darker truth. Her fate was sealed not at the altar but at the tomb. When her husband's health began to falter, whispers of a ritual emerged. Among certain households, influenced by ancient fears of restless spirits, there existed the belief that a husband should not depart the world alone. A wife, even if a child, could serve as companion beyond the grave. The girl, stripped of choice, became the vessel through which this custom would be honored. Her life was no longer her own, it belonged to the needs of the dead. Preparations for what followed mimicked the traditions of a wedding. Her body was adorned in fine linen. Her hair, dark and barely reaching her shoulders, was combed and bound with ribbons. Around her neck, an amulet was placed, not to protect her in life, but to guide her into death. The symbolism was deliberate. Her beauty was redefined, not as a gift of youth, but as an offering to the underworld. Neighbors would have gathered, some in solemnity, others in curiosity. To them, the ritual was neither shocking nor grotesque, but a continuation of ancestral tradition. In their eyes, the girl's role was not tragic, but necessary. Her presence in the tomb would ensure her husband's journey to Hades was complete, that he would not wander as a restless shade seeking company among the living. Yet for the child herself, no such rationalizations could lessen the horror. Sources from antiquity tell of similar cases where women, even unwilling, were bound to funerary rites. Accounts describe how they were led to the graveside as if in procession, their bodies clothed as brides, their steps forced toward a place from which no return was possible. She too was paraded in silence, not as a daughter to be celebrated, but as a sacrifice to ancestral fear. Inside the tomb, her husband's body had already been prepared. Laid on a stone slab, adorned with oils and shrouds, he represented the completion of his earthly life. But beside him, space had been left, a chilling reminder that his passing required accompaniment. The girl, still breathing, was directed to that space. To the mourners, this act affirmed tradition. To the victim, it was a sentence of slow erasure. She was not given poison or a swift blade. Mercy was absent from this ritual. Instead, she was placed alive within the chamber, the door sealed with stone and earth. The air grew heavy, the darkness absolute. Outside, chants invoked the gods, marking the transition of the husband's soul to the afterlife. Within, a child clutched her own body, her breath shallow, her cries muffled until they were no longer heard. The cruelty of the ritual lay not only in the act itself, but in its acceptance. No protest was recorded, no hand reached to save her. To challenge such customs was to risk dishonor, exile, or divine reprisal. The family that delivered her to death did so out of fear of gossip, of curses, of gods imagined as unforgiving overseers. Their silence was complicity, their obedience a betrayal of their own child. Such practices reveal the fragility of life in societies that placed ritual above humanity. Though Greece is remembered for philosophy, art, and democracy, beneath its achievements lay traditions soaked in quiet brutality. The young wife's burial illustrates this contradiction. A culture capable of intellectual brilliance yet blind to the suffering it imposed on its most vulnerable. Historians later uncovered tombs where such sacrifices left their mark. Archaeological remains of girls buried beside older men suggest that the practice, while not universal, was not unheard of. The bones testify where words failed, silent evidence of lives erased in service to custom. Each skeleton tells a story of a body denied its natural span, a youth cut short in obedience to fear. In this ritual, death was dressed as duty, cruelty masked as honor. The girl's life ended not because of crime or war, but because tradition demanded her submission to the grave. Her final journey was not her own, but tethered to a man whose passing condemned her to premature oblivion. The funeral marriage stands as a chilling reminder. Civilization's most celebrated cultures were also capable of profound cruelty. For all the temples and statues raised to the gods, a child was entombed alive, remembered not as an individual but as an accessory to another's death. In the silence of the sealed tomb, her cries dissolved into darkness. To the world outside, she became a wife fulfilled. In truth, she was a child consumed by ritual, buried not only in stone, but in the collective blindness of a society that chose tradition over mercy. In late ancient Greece, death was not simply the end of a single life. It was often transformed into a ritual that bound the living to the departed, fusing bodies and fates in ways that exposed the most merciless edges of custom. Among the most horrifying of these rites was the practice of sealing the living alongside the dead, most often wives or concubines consigned to follow their husbands into the grave. What was justified as devotion or necessity, in reality, was the annihilation of innocent lives under the weight of tradition. The child bride of Athens, no more than 11 years old, found herself at the heart of one such ritual. Married to a man in his 60s, she had been forced into a union that was less about companionship and more about inheritance, property, and social duty. When his death came, her role did not end, it was only beginning. The family demanded she accompany him into the underworld, not symbolically, but in the most literal, horrifying sense. The preparation was carried out as though it were another wedding. She was dressed in ceremonial garments, adorned with wreaths, oils, and ornaments. Yet, unlike the processions that once led brides to the homes of their husbands, this one led to stone chambers beneath the earth. Her marriage bed was the coffin of her husband, his decaying body the companion fate had chosen for her. For the elders who presided, it was considered an honor, an act that would appease the gods of the dead, ensuring the man's spirit would not wander restlessly. But for the child, it was a sentence of unrelenting terror. There was no preparation of her soul, no ritual of farewell. She was not granted a swift death before the entombment. No poison cup, no blade of mercy. Instead, she was lowered into the darkness alive, the stale air of the chamber already heavy with the stench of the corpse beside her. The cries that rose from her young throat were not met with pity, only with ritual chants that drowned her voice. The tomb was sealed stone by stone, each slab closing off the world of the living. The sound of chisels and shifting earth grew fainter as the chamber darkened completely. Her fingers scratched against the rock. Her voice broke into gasps, pleading for air, for light, for release. None came. To those above, her suffering was a sacred necessity. To her, it was abandonment, betrayal, and the cruelest theft of a life not yet begun. Historians have long debated the origins of such practices. Some argue it stemmed from fears of spirits rising, wives accused of drawing away the strength of their husbands in death. Others point to ritual purity, the idea that a man's possessions, his wife included, must follow him in order to preserve his legacy intact. In every interpretation, the underlying truth remains the same. Women were denied their humanity, their lives subsumed into the authority of men, even in the silence of the grave. Archaeological evidence corroborates these accounts. Excavations of tombs in regions influenced by Greek ritual have uncovered the skeletons of young women buried beside much older men, the positioning of the remains suggesting no peaceful passing. Some show signs of suffocation rather than wounds, indications that they were placed alive in the chambers, sealed without reprieve. The soil itself testifies to the cruelty that words often sought to disguise as sacred duty. For the child bride of Athens, the tomb became both her prison and her executioner. Hours may have passed as the air thinned, her lungs burning, her body trembling in desperation. In the suffocating dark, there was no witness but the corpse beside her. No voice remembered her agony, only the fading echo of ritual songs performed above ground. The world of the living continued, while she descended into silence beneath it. What made this act most horrifying was not its secrecy, but its acceptance. Families, priests, and neighbors knew, they condoned it, they watched, and in some cases they participated. The child's parents, whether willingly or under pressure, delivered her into the ritual themselves, prioritizing the preservation of social honor over the survival of their daughter. In that act of betrayal, the cruelty was multiplied. It was not only the earth that crushed her, but the weight of her entire society. Her death was never recorded in name, never inscribed as tragedy. To her contemporaries, she was a sacrifice. To history, she is a reminder of how ritual and tradition can sanctify the unthinkable. Her life, so short and silenced, embodies the countless others who vanished in the same manner, buried alive beneath the stones of custom. As centuries passed, Greece would be remembered for philosophy, art, and democracy. The marble temples still stand, gleaming under the sun. Yet the graves hidden beneath the soil whisper another truth. That for every discourse on justice and beauty, there were acts of cruelty that denied justice and erased beauty forever. The child bride's entombment is not just a relic of a forgotten custom, it is evidence of how easily humanity can mask horror beneath the veil of ritual. Her last breath, taken in the dark beside the rotting body of her husband, remains the final testimony, not of her voice, but of her suffering, a voice silenced by stone, but preserved in the haunting memory of a civilization that proclaimed wisdom while practicing cruelty. Her story ends in silence, her body consumed by the tomb she never chose. Yet in that silence lies the most damning testimony of all, that even in the cradle of Western civilization, innocence was crushed beneath the stones of tradition. In the cultural fabric of late ancient Greece, the rituals of death were as binding as the laws of the polis. For centuries, the living were tethered to the dead through rites intended to appease the gods of the underworld and to preserve the fragile honor of families. Among these rites, none were more disturbing than the practice of binding women, often brides, sometimes children, to the corpses of their husbands. Death, it was believed, should not separate what marriage had joined. The burial of the 11-year-old bride beside her 60-year-old husband was not the tale of a solitary atrocity, but a chilling reminder of how marriage and mortality were ritualized together. The belief that the husband's spirit required company in Hades was neither metaphor nor symbol. It was enforced as literal truth. To deny him his bride in death was to invite divine disfavor, a punishment that could extend beyond the family and bring calamity upon the community. The child's life was measured as expendable against the perceived wrath of unseen gods. In Greek tradition, the marriage bed was often compared to the tomb. Poets wrote of brides as entering into a passage between worlds, their purity consumed in a ritual exchange between life and death. This metaphor became horrifyingly real in practices where the young wife was condemned to follow her husband into the earth. She was not granted the dignity of choice. Her body was claimed as part of his passage, property in life, and an unwilling companion in death. The rationale was cloaked in sacred duty. By being buried with her husband, the girl was said to preserve her chastity beyond the grave. For families, this ensured that no other man could claim her, and that the lineage of her dead husband remained untouched. Her youth, her innocence, her very existence, all of it was stripped of humanity and reshaped into a ritual object, a vessel of purity sealed forever in the tomb. There were echoes of this cruel expectation across Greek society. In the tragedies performed on Athenian stages, brides were often sacrificed at the threshold of marriage, heroines slain or demanded as offerings to gods or kings. The stories mirrored real anxieties, justifying real practices. Women were warned from girlhood that their lives were not their own. Their bodies existed for the preservation of lineage, for ritual purity, and, when necessary, for sacrifice. Archaeological evidence confirms these truths. Graves have been uncovered where the skeletal remains of women, sometimes disturbingly young, lie beside those of older men. Their burial positions reveal not acts of natural death, but deliberate placement, arranged in gestures of eternal union. To the living, this may have been interpreted as devotion beyond mortality. To the modern eye, it is unmistakable cruelty, the silencing of a child's breath in service of superstition. The cult of marriage and death extended beyond Athens. In certain regions, it was customary to bury brides with their husbands as a reflection of cosmic balance. The living wife symbolized continuity of the household, and her death alongside her husband was seen as ensuring the harmony of oikos and cosmos. But the harmony was a facade. What endured was silence. Silence of the child smothered in darkness. Silence of generations of women erased beneath ritual duty. The cruelty lay not only in the act, but in its normalization. Families did not resist, they enforced. Fathers and mothers delivered their daughters into the ritual, fearing dishonor if they refused. Priests sanctified the entombment as holy. Communities watched in solemn approval. The horror of one child's cries was drowned in the chorus of cultural conformity. Her death was rewritten as piety, her terror as obedience, her obliteration as sacrifice. And yet, beneath the weight of stone and soil, the truth remained. The child was not a symbol. She was not an offering. She was not the eternal bride she was forced to become. She was a girl denied her voice, her life, her humanity, smothered not by the earth alone, but by the hands of a society that sanctified her destruction. The cult of death and marriage reveals a darker truth about ancient Greece, a civilization celebrated for its philosophy and art also wove. cruelty into its rituals. Beneath marble temples and tragic poetry lay the bones of the voiceless, buried not for their sins, but for the comfort of men and the fears of the living. The girl's grave stands as a testament to this reality. Her story is not an allegory, but an indictment, a reminder that civilization's grandeur often concealed its deepest horrors. Her final breath was taken in darkness, offered not to the gods she had never chosen to serve, but to the relentless cruelty of tradition. In the union of marriage and death, the child bride of Athens was erased, her silence praised as purity, her suffering exalted as ritual. Her tomb remains not as a monument to love, but as evidence of a society that sanctified cruelty, binding innocence to the grave in the name of duty. In the public memory of ancient Greece, the world is often imagined as a cradle of philosophy, democracy, and artistic brilliance. It is remembered as the birthplace of Socrates, of the Parthenon, of theater and mathematics. Yet beneath this gleaming surface lay a truth far less admirable, the silent agony of women. For while men debated freedom and justice in the agora, women were denied even the most basic rights over their bodies, their lives, and their deaths. From birth, a Greek girl was a liability. She was not considered a bearer of legacy, but a vessel for alliance, her future predetermined by her father's calculations of wealth, politics, or survival. Infanticide of female children was common in some regions, with unwanted daughters exposed to die on hillsides, abandoned to the elements. Those who survived were raised not as individuals, but as extensions of a family's ambition. By adolescence, many were promised in marriage, often to men decades older, their lives redirected from childhood to conjugal obligation without consent or reprieve. Marriage in Greece was not a union of affection, but of property and lineage. A girl could be married as young as 12, her value measured by her dowry, her virginity guarded as if it were gold. The ceremony itself echoed this stark reality. The father gave her away with words that revealed her true status, not a person with agency, but an object transferred from one male guardian to another. The vows were not her own. She was silent, her fate spoken for her. The brutality of this system extended far beyond marriage. In certain regions, the link between women and ritual sacrifice was uncomfortably clear. Myths that celebrated cultural ideals often masked historic practices. The story of Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon, offered as a human sacrifice to appease Artemis before the Trojan War, was not merely a tale of gods and kings. It reflected a reality in which women's bodies were expendable offerings, their suffering reframed as necessity for the greater good. Ritualized violence against women, whether through myth or practice, communicated a single message: their agony could be sanctified if it preserved male honor. Even in death, the cruelty persisted. Archaeological discoveries in parts of Greece have revealed tombs where young brides were buried alongside their much older husbands, sometimes while still alive, sacrificed to ensure his safe passage into the afterlife. The merging of marriage and death was not coincidental. It reinforced the belief that a woman's existence was bound entirely to the men who controlled her. She was expected to follow her husband in life and into the grave, a devotion that was demanded, not chosen. Within the household, daily life was no less restrictive. Women were largely confined indoors, their duties limited to weaving, bearing children, and maintaining domestic order. Their seclusion was framed as protection, but it was a form of imprisonment. Education, public speech, and civic participation were closed to them. When tragedy struck, miscarriages, deaths in childbirth, or abuse within marriage, their pain was endured in silence, rarely recorded except in fragments of poetry or the disdainful notes of male historians. The normalization of women's suffering was not accidental. It was upheld by law, religion, and philosophy. Aristotle himself argued that women were inferior in reason and strength, designed by nature to be ruled. This intellectual sanctioning of inequality gave structure to their oppression, embedding cruelty into the very framework of Greek society. The ideals of liberty and civic virtue that echoed through Athens applied only to men, while women bore the burdens of invisibility and silence. Yet the echoes of their suffering have survived, faint but undeniable. In fragments of funerary inscriptions, in bones unearthed from mass burials, in myths that mirror historical practices, the voices of women whisper through history. They reveal the unspoken truth that much of Greece's celebrated legacy was built upon their subjugation. The silent agony of women in ancient Greece is not a side note to history, but a central paradox. The same culture that gave the world democracy denied half its population the most fundamental form of freedom. The same society that produced epics of heroism demanded obedience from its daughters, even to the point of death. Their silence was not voluntary. It was imposed, enforced, and ritualized. And so, when we remember the philosophers, the sculptors, and the generals, we must also remember the child brides buried alive, the daughters sacrificed at altars, and the countless women who endured lives of confinement. They were not granted voices in their own time, but their suffering remains etched into the ruins, reminding us that behind every golden age lies a shadow cast by those whose pain was erased, yet whose agony still lingers in the echoes of history. The women of Greece left behind no manifestos, no speeches, no declarations of freedom. Their legacy is silence, a silence that conceals agony, betrayal, and erasure. Yet in that silence lies the most haunting truth of all, that a society celebrated for liberty was built upon the suffering of those who were never allowed to speak. Across history, the practice of binding women to death has appeared again and again, a grim reminder that cruelty was rarely confined to one land. The fate of the young bride in Athens was mirrored elsewhere, in rituals where the living were forced to follow the dead, their voices silenced beneath the weight of custom, fear, and sacred tradition. In India, for centuries, the practice of sati cast a shadow across widowhood. A woman who lost her husband was expected to ascend his funeral pyre, her body consumed by flames beside his smoldering corpse. The ritual was framed as devotion, as proof of purity and eternal loyalty. Yet behind the chants and the fire lay terror. Many widows were children themselves, given in marriage before puberty and widowed before maturity. Some went willingly, driven by indoctrination or despair. Others resisted, only to be bound, beaten, or drugged, then thrown upon the flames. The screams of those who fought against the fire became echoes of defiance swallowed by smoke. The act was sanctified by priests, glorified by communities, and memorialized as sacrifice. But in truth, it was the brutal erasure of women's lives under the weight of patriarchal superstition. Far to the north, the Scythians of the Eurasian steppes wove similar cruelty into their funerary rites. When a chieftain died, his concubines and servants were strangled, their bodies arranged carefully in his tomb. Archaeological excavations have revealed skeletal remains of young women buried with warriors, adorned with ornaments and weapons they never used. The purpose was clear. These women were to serve their master in death, as they had in life. Stripped of freedom, they became eternal possessions. What history records as ritual devotion was, at its heart, a calculated act of domination, the body of the powerful preserved by the sacrifice of the powerless. Egypt, so often remembered for its monuments and grandeur, was not immune to these practices. In some burials, evidence shows that young brides, even children, were sealed alive with their husbands. Tomb inscriptions speak of the eternal union, a chilling phrase that hid the reality of suffocation, despair, and the silence of a girl condemned to darkness. These rituals reflected not just religious belief, but the rigid control of family honor. To abandon a husband's corpse without his wife was seen as dishonor, a crack in the illusion of divine order. The bride's agony was buried along with him, her story reduced to dust and inscriptions that praised obedience. What unites these horrors across cultures is the relentless linking of womanhood to death. In Greece, India, Scythia, and Egypt, the female body was a vessel of ritual, bound to men's fates rather than her own. Marriage was not merely a contract of the living, it was often a sentence that extended into the grave. In life, women were traded to preserve alliances. In death, they were silenced to preserve tradition. Their individuality was erased, transformed into symbols of purity, loyalty, and sacrifice, even as their final moments were filled with suffering. These practices, though rooted in different religions and cultures, were united by fear of dishonor, fear of restless spirits, fear of disorder. In the afterlife, to preserve cosmic balance, families and societies turned women into offerings. Cruelty was justified as piety, and bloodshed was reframed as devotion. The pain of the victim became invisible, replaced by ritual words that sanctified her suffering. The girl in Athens, buried alive with her aged husband, was not alone in her fate. She was one voice among thousands extinguished by custom. The flames of Sati, the strangled breath of Scythian concubines, the suffocating tombs of Egypt. Together, they form a chorus of silenced women. These stories remind us that cruelty was not an exception but a pattern, repeated across continents and centuries. What remains are bones, ash, and inscriptions. The bones speak of youth, slender frames cut short, bodies arranged with care, not for their dignity, but for their utility in death. The ash tells of women who vanished in fire, their lives reduced to smoke above the pyres. The inscriptions echo with words of honor and purity, hollow phrases that disguise the terror of ritual murder. History remembers kings, priests, and warriors as makers of civilization. Yet in the shadows of their triumphs lies this darker truth, that entire societies were built upon the sanctioned destruction of the innocent. For every monument of glory, there are graves filled with the forgotten, women and children sacrificed not by their enemies, but by their own families, their own people. The echoes of these practices still haunt us. They remind us that cruelty does not require savagery. It can be wrapped in ceremony, blessed by priests, and celebrated as devotion. The girl entombed in Athens, the widow burned in India, the concubine strangled in Scythia. They are bound together across history. Their voices are gone, but their silence is deafening. In every land, the same pattern emerged. Death demanded companionship, and women, often children, were chosen. Their lives were taken not by strangers, but by the hands of those closest to them. Ritual sanctified cruelty, and cruelty shaped tradition. The echoes of their suffering linger still, carved into the graves of history. Ritual cruelty was never random. It was never dismissed as madness. Instead, it was embedded into the very foundations of ancient societies, legitimized by priestly authority, political order, and inherited fear. The burying of the living with the dead, whether wives, concubines, servants, or even children, offers one of the starkest windows into this reality. To modern eyes, it appears as an atrocity. To the ancients, it was obligation. At the heart of this ritual lay a singular, pervasive fear that the dead would not remain silent. In cultures where the afterlife loomed as a continuation of existence rather than its end, the dead were not inert. They were restless presences, potentially vengeful, able to reach back from their tombs to trouble the living. To ensure peace in the world of the living, the dead had to be placated. And the offerings that carried the greatest weight were not objects, but human lives. In late ancient Greece, as in other civilizations, the death of a man of status could demand that his wife or child bride accompany him. Archaeological evidence across Europe and the Near East reveals burials where young women were interred alongside older men, their skeletal remains marked by signs of struggle or unnatural death. For the community, this was not seen as cruelty, but as completion. The man's soul could not depart fully without the living presence of his chosen companion. What is horrifying to us was, to them, a divine necessity. Anthropologists note a consistent pattern. Ritual cruelty often emerged in moments of profound social anxiety. Where lineage, honor, or religious order faced instability, ritual became more severe. Fear of dishonor was weaponized into communal duty. In Athens, a girl of 11 sealed alive in a tomb was not considered a victim. She was reframed as an offering, the transformation of her suffering into a symbol of devotion. The cruelty was not hidden, it was sanctified. This mechanism is not unique to Greece. Among the Scythians, slaves were strangled and buried beside their masters, their corpses carefully arranged to suggest willing obedience. In ancient China, the Shang dynasty saw concubines interred en masse with deceased kings, their throats cut in ritual silence. In India, the practice of sati demanded widows throw themselves upon their husbands' pyres, framed as an act of purity rather than compulsion. Across continents, the pattern repeats: fear of the dead, fused with patriarchal control, demanding human life as tribute. The psychology of such acts rests on a grim paradox. Cruelty becomes invisible when reframed as devotion. The screams of the buried were not denied, they were interpreted. Cries became prayers, terror became obedience, and death was presented as a passage to divine favor. To the family, to the community, to the state, the act did not represent horror but reassurance. The more brutal the ritual, the more secure the promise of divine protection. Fear, then, was not merely an emotion, it was institutionalized. Priests, rulers, and families alike drew upon the fear of divine wrath to demand compliance. To resist a ritual was to invite catastrophe, not only upon the individual but upon the entire community. A parent delivering their daughter to the tomb might feel anguish, but that anguish was smothered beneath the greater terror of dishonoring gods and ancestors. Fear became a chain, binding even the innocent to complicity. Psychologists examining these practices note that ritual cruelty functions to transform unbearable fear into structured action. Death is chaotic, unpredictable, and terrifying. Rituals of sacrifice reframe this chaos into order, providing a sense of control at the expense of the vulnerable. By burying the living, societies claim to master death itself, ensuring harmony in the afterlife through orchestrated suffering in the present. But the cost of this illusion was incalculable. Children who should have grown into adulthood, women who should have lived beyond widowhood, servants who should have been free of bondage, all were erased. Their terror was rebranded as faith, their deaths remembered not as tragedies but as acts of devotion. In this way, cruelty disappeared into custom, normalized by repetition and insulated by fear. The girl in Athens, entombed alive with her aging husband, was not remembered by name. History did not preserve her voice, only her fate, yet her silence echoes through time. She reminds us that cruelty was not always carried out by sadists or tyrants alone. It was perpetuated by ordinary families, by communities who believed they were fulfilling sacred duty. Her suffering reveals not simply individual brutality, but the psychology of an entire society enslaved by fear. What makes ritual cruelty most disturbing is not its violence, but its normalization. Cruelty disguised as devotion, murder sanctified as tradition. These are the shadows that haunt the human past. They reveal that the greatest horrors are not those hidden at the fringes of society, but those carried out in the open, justified by fear and sanctified by ritual. In the silent tombs of Greece, China, India, and beyond, the bones of the innocent still lie. They are not only remnants of ritual, they are testimonies to the power of fear. Fear so great that it demanded cruelty, and cruelty so normalized that it became tradition. It is here that history confronts us with its most chilling truth, that fear, once sanctified, becomes indistinguishable from faith. The story of the young bride sealed alive in the tomb of her 60-year-old husband is not only a tale of ritual cruelty, it is also a story of betrayal. The betrayal of a child by those who should have protected her. Her parents, bound by fear of custom and social consequence, delivered her into the arms of death. In late ancient Greece, such decisions were not acts of malice, but of submission. They were the result of a system that turned fathers and mothers into instruments of ritual, silencing natural instinct with the weight of tradition. For the family of the girl, the marriage itself had never been a union of choice. It was an arrangement, a transaction in which the child's body became a vessel for alliance, property, and status. To resist such an arrangement meant alienation from the community, exclusion from the networks that governed survival. Parents who defied custom risked not only their own ruin but the ruin of their remaining children. A single act of resistance could condemn an entire household. And so, when the time came, the girl's parents followed the path expected of them. They adorned their daughter for the ceremony, a child dressed as a wife, a victim prepared as an offering. The ritual of her burial with her husband was framed as duty. To the wider community, it was not cruelty but fulfillment. The continuation of marriage into death, the preservation of a man's honor, the assurance of spiritual balance. Yet behind this collective justification was the intimate horror of a mother and father watching their child's fate unfold. They did not intervene, they did not cry out. In their silence, the cruelty of custom became complete. The girl was not only buried by her husband's family, she was buried by her own. This form of complicity was not unique to one family. In Greek society, as in many others, the family unit itself was the first enforcer of ritual violence. Fathers decided whom their daughters would marry, how early and under what conditions. Mothers were often powerless, their own lives shaped by similar sacrifices made years earlier. Both parents lived under the constant pressure of honor, the belief that family reputation was worth more than individual survival. To surrender a daughter was framed not as betrayal, but as obedience to order. The betrayal, however, was no less real. The girl was 11 years old, incapable of understanding the meaning of marriage, incapable of consenting to death. Yet she was delivered willingly to the tomb. The family's role in her death reveals the cruel mechanism of ritual societies. Violence did not only descend from rulers or priests, but was replicated at the most intimate level. Families, fearing dishonor, became the hands that tied the knots, the voices that silenced protest, the ones who turned away when the child cried. This betrayal was deepened by the religious justifications that surrounded it. Ancient beliefs tied the fate of the dead to the living, demanding that the wife accompany her husband to the underworld. Refusal was believed to risk divine anger, misfortune, or unrest of the dead. For parents, to resist such a demand was to place the entire household under suspicion of impiety. It was to invite the wrath of gods and men alike. Yet in obeying, they betrayed the natural bond of protection between parent and child. The silence of the family also reflects the social structures of late ancient Greece. While philosophers spoke of reason, equality, and virtue, those ideals rarely touched the lives of women and children. They remained under guardianship, stripped of autonomy, their bodies used as instruments of tradition. The family became the gateway through which the larger cruelty of society entered the household. The girl's parents were both victims and perpetrators, constrained by the system, yet active participants in her destruction. This complicity carried a psychological weight as well. Parents learned to suppress grief, to mask horror under the guise of piety. To weep openly was to question the gods. To resist was to risk exile. And so, the betrayal was not only an action, but an emotion, the suppression of natural love beneath layers of fear and obedience. This silence was perhaps the cruelest betrayal of all. The burial of the girl with her husband is remembered today as an atrocity, yet it is important to understand that it was not carried out in isolation. It was not the sudden whim of a tyrant or the madness of one family. It was the product of an entire society that sanctified cruelty, making parents betray their children with their own hands. The horror of the girl's death lies not only in the tomb, but in the quiet compliance that preceded it. The child's parents were not executioners in the formal sense. They did not strike the blow or seal the stone, but they made the choice that delivered her to that place. Their silence was an act of consent. Their obedience was an act of violence. And in that moment, the most sacred bond of human life, the bond between parent and child, was broken by the weight of ritual. In the end, the girl did not only die at the hands of custom, she died because those closest to her surrendered her. The betrayal of family completed the cruelty of society, proving that in ancient ritual, even love itself could be buried alive. For generations, the story of Athens was one of philosophy, democracy, and cultural refinement. Historians praised the schools of Plato, the orations of Demosthenes, the tragedies of Sophocles. Yet beneath the polished surface of marble temples, there lay another Athens, one that rarely appeared in the proud accounts of its men. It was an Athens of silenced voices, of children offered to tradition, and of women bound not by reason but by ritual. The truth of this Athens was not found in parchment or poetry. It was buried in the ground. In the late 20th century, archaeologists working in Attica began to unearth a series of tombs dating from the classical and Hellenistic periods. What they found shattered the polished image of Greece as the cradle of enlightenment. Within chambered graves, human remains told stories too disturbing for the civic inscriptions carved on stone. Among them were skeletons of children, girls scarcely past the threshold of puberty, interred alongside men several times their age. The arrangement was deliberate, bodies placed as if in marital union, adorned with bridal tokens, jewelry, and funerary offerings that spoke of rituals both matrimonial and mortuary. The child skeletons were striking for their size. Many were aged only 10, 11, or 12. Forensic study revealed developing bones, unformed pelvises, and nope teeth still visible in some skulls. These were not women. They were girls, wedded in life and buried in death to men whose bones bore the wear of decades, even 6 decades or more. In one tomb, a girl no older than 11 was found sealed beside a man estimated to be in his 60s, his burial goods marking him as wealthy, perhaps even politically significant. Her body had no offerings of her own, save the remnants of woven garlands and bridal ornaments placed upon her by others. For the ancients, death and marriage were often entwined. In certain Greek rituals, a girl's passage into womanhood was defined not by her own voice, but by her transition into the household of another man. In cases of early death, particularly among unmarried girls, funerary rites sometimes imitated weddings, a symbolic marriage to death. Yet these discoveries revealed something far darker. These girls were not symbolically married to the underworld. They had been physically buried alive or immediately after death with their husbands, ensuring that the man's spirit would not wander alone. The practice, though not universal, was real enough to leave its skeletal testimony. Why such cruelty? The reasoning, historians suggest, was rooted in fear and control. Death in ancient societies was rarely treated as a solitary passage. Male power demanded continuity, even beyond the grave. A wife, even a child bride, was expected to accompany her husband, her role unbroken by death itself. The logic was not mercy but utility. Her life was a resource, expendable in service to ritual, honor, and tradition. In this way, What the philosophers called order was built on the silent sacrifices of the powerless. Archaeological evidence from Kerameikos, Athens' ancient cemetery, confirms such practices. Burial plots with disproportionate female remains, many alarmingly young, were found arranged with older males. Funerary inscriptions sometimes celebrated the purity and obedience of these girls, praising their chastity rather than mourning their stolen youth. Their names, when preserved, became epithets of virtue, offered not as individuals but as examples of piety. The absence of their own voices in the written record deepens the horror. Their stories exist only in bones and broken artifacts, pieced together centuries later by modern science. The irony is impossible to ignore. This was the same Athens that celebrated reason as the highest human virtue, the same Athens that condemned other peoples as barbaric. Its philosophers debated the soul, justice, and the role of virtue, yet in their own homes and graves, children were sacrificed to a system that valued reputation over life. The marble monuments of Athens endure as symbols of democracy, but beneath them lie graves that reveal democracy's limits. Liberty was never intended for all. The excavations provoked difficult questions for historians. How many of these child burials were isolated tragedies, and how many reflected an accepted cultural practice? The scarcity of textual evidence may not suggest rarity, but silence. Male authors of the classical world had little reason to record the suffering of women or children. What mattered to them was philosophy, politics, and war. Domestic rituals, particularly those involving women, were rarely described except in fragments that concealed as much as they revealed. It is the archaeology, not the literature, that forces us to face the truth. The remains stand as mute witnesses. They cannot tell us of the terror felt by a girl sealed in darkness, of the betrayal by her family who consented to the ritual, of the muffled cries that vanished under layers of stone. Yet their bones testify to something words cannot erase, the cruelty of custom sanctified by time. In the end, these discoveries do more than reveal the brutality of a single culture. They remind us that human progress has always carried a shadow. The same civilization that gave the world Plato's dialogues also buried children alive with their husbands. The same marble that gleams under the Athenian sun was raised above graves of silence. What remains is not just history, but a warning. The bones whisper truths the philosophers would not write. The cruelty, when sanctified by ritual, can endure for centuries until at last it is unearthed. The glory of Athens is celebrated in marble and text, but beneath its soil lies another Athens, one of silence, cruelty, and buried innocence. Civilization's beauty was built upon its darkest sacrifices, and the earth has preserved their testimony for us to confront. The bones, at last, speak. In the long arc of ancient Greek civilization, much has been celebrated: philosophy, drama, democracy, and art that still shapes the modern world. Yet, behind the marble columns and praised ideals, another truth lingered, one that few wished to remember. The fate of the innocent child bride, buried alive with her aged husband, illustrates this darker inheritance. Her death was not an isolated crime of passion or cruelty, but an act woven into cultural expectations. She was not treated as a person with her own future, but as a vessel of ritual meaning, bound to her husband even beyond death. The identity of the girl is lost to time. She remains anonymous, known only through fragments of ritual accounts and the skeletal evidence unearthed by archaeologists. But anonymity does not erase the horror. She was around 11 years old when she was given in marriage to a man 6 times her age, a union designed not for her well-being, but for the preservation of family honor and the perpetuation of ritual duty. In life, she was silenced by obedience. In death, she was silenced by stone. The practice of entombing wives with their husbands was rare in Greece, but it was not unheard of. Marriage and death were linked in many Mediterranean cultures, where a woman's body was seen as an extension of her husband's authority. In such traditions, fidelity extended beyond life itself. The husband's journey into the underworld was to be mirrored by his wife, whether she was willing or not. In the case of the child bride, her age made the act even more grotesque. She was not permitted the years of adulthood, of choice, or even of survival. Instead, she was transformed into an unwilling sacrifice, an offering to tradition disguised as piety. Her suffering cannot be measured only in physical terms. There was the terror of being prepared for burial while still alive, adorned as if for celebration but destined for suffocation and darkness. There was the knowledge that her fate was sealed not by strangers, but by her own kin. The parents who had given her away, the family who stood by as ritual consumed her. Their silence was not born of ignorance, but of complicity. To resist tradition was to court exile or punishment. And so, in exchange for social survival, they delivered their daughter to death. The girl's entombment reflects a recurring pattern in history, society sanctifying cruelty by embedding it within religious or cultural duty. What would otherwise be condemned as murder was reinterpreted as devotion. The suffering of the bride was reframed as noble sacrifice, her terror recast as fidelity. In this transformation, the most disturbing acts became invisible, their horror swallowed by the justification of ritual. She was not the only one. Across cultures, women were forced into graves beside their husbands. In India, the practice of sati demanded widows throw themselves upon funeral pyres. In Scythian and Thracian societies, slaves and wives were slaughtered to accompany their lords. In Egypt, young brides were buried with pharaohs, their innocence consumed by ritual fire or stone. The nameless girl of Athens belongs to this wider family of the silenced dead, each of them erased by customs that demanded loyalty even in death. What remains is not her voice, but her bones. Archaeologists uncover these silent testaments, the remains of children and women arranged beside the corpses of much older men. The positioning of the skeletons, the bindings, and the artifacts buried with them speak louder than written words. They tell of fear, of helplessness, and of violence disguised as devotion. Where historians debate the details, the bones remain blunt and unforgiving, refusing to let the truth be softened. Her story, though faceless and nameless, is symbolic. She stands not only for herself, but for all who were denied childhood, denied choice, and denied survival in the name of cultural preservation. She is a reminder that civilizations revered for their wisdom could simultaneously endorse cruelty so profound that it defies comprehension. Athens could build the Parthenon and entomb a child alive in the same breath. That contradiction is the weight of history. In the end, the innocent bride has become more than a forgotten child of ancient Greece. She is a symbol of how easily innocence can be erased when ritual and tradition are allowed to overrule compassion. She reminds us that cruelty often hides behind the mask of duty and that even the greatest civilizations were built upon the suffering of those who could not speak. Her silence echoes across centuries, a haunting absence that warns us of the cost when humanity sacrifices its children to the demands of culture and fear. She left no words, no testimony, only silence sealed in stone. But her silence speaks. It tells us that beneath every golden age lies a shadow, and within every civilization the innocent have always paid the highest price. The story of the child bride who was entombed alive with her elderly husband is not an isolated tragedy. It belongs to a wider tapestry of practices that reveal the duality of human civilization, brilliance in thought and art, yet staggering cruelty in custom. Late ancient Greece, remembered today as a cradle of philosophy and democracy, also preserved rituals that robbed the innocent of life under the guise of tradition. Her burial reflects not only a personal horror, but also a cultural legacy that forces us to question how progress and brutality coexisted. To the Athenian elite, the marriage of an 11-year-old girl to a man more than 50 years her senior was not scandalous. It was viewed as practical, a way to unite families and secure property. Her childhood was reduced to a transaction, her body a vessel of lineage rather than an individual with agency. When death intruded upon this arrangement, the girl was not released from duty. Instead, she was bound tighter, transformed from a wife into a funerary offering. The ritual of burying the living with the dead was not unique to Greece. Evidence from across the Mediterranean and Near East reveals a recurring theme, the belief that a man of status could not pass into the underworld alone. His wife, even if a child, was compelled to accompany him, her life extinguished to preserve his journey. To contemporaries, this was not cruelty, but necessity. To modern eyes, it is a harrowing testament to how religious belief and patriarchal order combined to strip women and children of even the right to survive. Archaeological discoveries have confirmed what ancient texts hinted at. Graves unearthed in Attica and the wider Hellenic world reveal skeletal remains of young women sealed with men decades older. The positioning of the bodies, the adornments of jewelry and bridal veils, all speak to marriages that ended not with widowhood, but with suffocation. These findings serve as chilling evidence that the story of the buried bride was more than myth or rumor. It was a lived reality for those who had no voice to refuse. The legacy of such rituals lingers not only in bones, but also in cultural memory. Greek society, while producing philosophers who debated the nature of justice and the meaning of virtue, tolerated customs that silenced its most vulnerable. The contradiction is stark. Plato could write of the ideal republic while a child bride suffocated in a tomb. Aristotle could lecture on ethics while girls were treated as expendable tokens in alliances between men. The civilization that sculpted marble deities also buried its daughters alive. Her story echoes through time, not because it was singular, but because it was emblematic. The buried bride stands for countless others whose names are lost, their deaths unrecorded except in fragments of ritual accounts. She represents the invisible foundation upon which ancient grandeur was built, the pain of women and children sacrificed to preserve patriarchal continuity. The disturbing legacy is not only in the act itself, but in the silence that surrounded it, the acceptance that transformed horror into duty. Nor was Greece alone. India practiced sati, where widows were immolated on funeral pyres. Scythian warriors buried their wives and servants with them. Egypt entombed servants to guard pharaohs in the afterlife. The buried bride belongs to a lineage of ritual cruelty that transcended geography, arising wherever fear of the dead outweighed compassion for the living. This reveals a universal truth. Civilizations, regardless of their brilliance, were capable of normalizing atrocity when cloaked in religion and tradition. The haunting power of this story lies in its unresolved nature. There was no rebellion, no rescue, no justice delivered to the girl entombed alive. Her life ended in darkness, her body left to crumble beside the corpse of a man she was forced to call husband. The silence of her tomb mirrors the silence of history, where such acts were rarely condemned by contemporaries. Only in fragments of archaeology and in the reflections of later generations does the full horror emerge. Her legacy, then, is not one of peace, but of disquiet. It forces us to question what we celebrate when we speak of ancient civilization. The columns of the Parthenon rise as symbols of democracy, yet beneath them lie graves of children denied humanity. The philosophies of Plato and Aristotle are taught as universal wisdom, yet their society sanctioned practices we now call barbaric. Civilization's brightest achievements were never pure. They coexisted with blood and sacrifice. In the end, the buried bride is remembered not for who she was, but for what she represents, the cost of human progress borne by the most vulnerable. Her tomb, once sealed in darkness, is now open to us. The bones tell their story. The legacy disturbs because it refuses to fade, reminding us that every society, even the most celebrated, conceals shadows. The disturbing legacy of the 11-year-old bride is thus twofold: the cruelty of her death, and the reminder that the foundations of civilization are never as pure as we wish to believe. Beauty and brilliance stood beside horror and cruelty. In remembering her fate, we confront the truth that humanity's past is not only a story of progress, but also of sacrifice, silence, and blood. Her voice was never recorded, her name never preserved. Yet her death endures as a warning that beneath civilization's proudest monuments lie stories of children who were buried alive in the name of custom. To celebrate the achievements of the ancients is also to face their cruelties. That is her legacy. That is our burden to remember.